Uh, Without further ado, next up is Nick Kindred, and he's going to talk to us about Module 4. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Gary, I appreciate you. Anytime Gary talks, and Zach Gary used to say this, anytime Gary talks, I listen. He's always got good things to add. So the only downside for me is it's a tough act to follow. But I appreciate you being here, Gary, and I appreciate you starting us off. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Kindred. I'm from California. Been officiating for a long time, but actually my background originally is in coaching. Like my second state tournament, they put me on the mat with a guy named Leroy Evans, who officiated 2 Olympics. And he actually was a biology teacher at the high school that I went to. He wasn't my wrestling coach. He was the former wrestling coach. So they put me on the mat with him, and he told me that I did a good job. And when a guy like that tells you do a good job, you keep doing it. So that's kind of how I got involved in officiating. And but again, background in coaching. So this group, these are my people, right? Coaches and officials. So I'm really happy, excited, and appreciative for the opportunity to present to you guys. So, and Module 4, as Tim alluded to, consists of these 4 topics: time management, total bout concept, passivity, and negative wrestling. Okay, and Tim put these together. So these are Tim's words, but it's a philosophy that we all kind of follow. There are 4 members of the officiating team: the mat chairman, the judge, and the referee. We're all familiar with those 3, but the clock is the 4th member. And if you're not actively engaged with the clock as one of those other 3 members, the clock will eat you alive, right? Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, we used to have the clinch, and we used to talk about, if you don't control the clinch will control you. Well, that has morphed into the clock, and the way that we make passivity calls and structure our matches. It really is, if you don't control the clock, it'll eat you alive. It's involved in every part of the bout, becomes the most important at critical times towards the end of the bout. So, and I like this part: timing of your calls is equally as important as evaluating the actions. I would argue it's more important, right? If I evaluate an action incorrectly, I got 2 people around me that can bail me out if I'm the referee, and we got coaches who can throw a brick. If I mistime passivity or incorrectly call passivity, incorrectly evaluate that, the coach has no recourse, right? There's 2 things a coach can't challenge. He can't challenge a confirmed fall, and he can't challenge a confirmed passivity. So to me, if we don't get this right, again, the coach has no recourse, no way of correcting that, right? So we as officials have to get this part right. And the part at the bottom here, if you make your calls too early, you end up, okay, you got points on the board, but then you got people standing around doing nothing. And again, our job as an officiating team is to stimulate action to get points. That's our job. And so the last thing we want is 2 minutes of guys standing around doing nothing, right? So if you call it too early, that's what you end up with. Of course, if you call things too late, you lock yourself out. And I'll share with you my worst moment as an official. I've had plenty of moments where people booed me and thought I got the call wrong and stuff like that. That stuff doesn't bother me. Probably my worst moment, I was a mat chairman and I hung my referee out to dry. He did everything he was supposed to do. He set up the calls the way he was supposed to set them up, and I didn't quite agree with him. And we were just kind of off. This was in the semifinals, Greco-Roman at the US Open. Somebody on this panel was sitting in the corner coaching. But he's probably the only one who agreed with the call because his guy won. But everybody else in the gym didn't agree. And I just felt bad that, you know what, the referee got it right. He did everything he was supposed to do with the clock. He did everything timing wise, and then I screwed up. So I have lived that part. If you make them too late, you get locked out, and then you're just kind of stuck with it. And I remember sitting there the last 45 seconds of that bout. Nothing I could do. There was no call to be made. I just had to sit there and eat it, and it was a lousy feeling. So I learned that one the hard way. All right. So totality of the bout. Who scored the points? How many? How did they score? Standing or parterre. So these are all really important parts, really important questions to ask. And I was taking notes when Gary was talking. He was talking about actions and who started it and where. So points on my bout sheet are similar. Like, how were they scored? So I can tell you, particularly in Greco-Roman, points scored from the feet carry more weight. So even on a bout sheet that says 2 points, and on the left it might say 2, and on the right it might say 2. But if these 2 points were scored from a standing position, in my mind, from a philosophical standpoint, they carry more weight than 2 points that were scored from an ordered parterre position. And so, again, that's part of that philosophy piece. And coaches, you guys need to know that, right? If we get points scored from the feet again in Greco-Roman, those are big time points. That's hard to do, right? A 7-0 bout in Greco-Roman from somebody who scored a takedown, a step out, and 2 turns from the takedown that they got versus a passive and 1 and 3 turns. Those are 2 totally different bouts. Those are 2 totally different 7-0 scores in our mind, right? So you guys need to know that as well. Also, when did they score, right? I think my first World Team Trials ever, I had it in my mind as we got in this philosophy part of like, hey, if you have 5 total points, you back off of passivity, 5 cumulative points, right? Well, early in the bout, this guy got a takedown, and then there was like a reversal and a turn. It all happened in the first like 8 seconds of the bout. So we had 5 total points, but it was, again, 8 seconds into the bout. So there's a philosophy, but that's, as Gary talked about, it's the gray areas, right? So we had 5 total points, but again, that happened. We still have 5 minutes and 52 seconds of wrestling. And so we can't just say, I think Tim was my mat chairman, and I think he bailed me out again. I like to share all the times I screwed up because there's plenty of them. So I think I was on the whistle, and I was like in my head, hey, we got 5 total points. We don't call passivity anymore. And luckily Tim was there to bail me out and teach me, like, no, we can keep calling passivity because all those points happened early, right? So again, how did they score? What position did they score from? When did those points occur? Those are all things that we keep in mind when we're thinking about this total bout concept. Who's been the aggressor? Who's been passive? That's probably the most critical piece when we're thinking about total bout, because as officials, I can tell you again, philosophically, when I step on the mat, I'm making the assumption that nobody's going to score any points. Like, I have to step on the mat with that mindset because that allows me to do my job. Luckily, and then as soon as guys score points, I'm like, oh, good, they did their job, and now I can back off, right? But when I step on the mat, they're in my mind, these guys aren't going to score. And so there's a formula that I have to follow in order to stimulate the action, and in order to make sure that I'm calling passivity, again, correctly and in a fair way, and in a way that everybody understands, right? And that's kind of what tonight's about, is going over that formula, going over the things that we're looking for, so that people understand it. Because the more we can calibrate that and share that out with people, the less surprises there are, right? So how much time is remaining? Understanding the significant and impacts of your passivity or negative wrestling calls on the entire bout, right? Specifically, are you making a call that's going to flip the winner, right? Like, is that a call you're making? And if you're making that call, should you be making that call? And certainly there are times where that is warranted, but you better be sure you know what times those are, right? You better be sure you understand when that's appropriate. So that's what we mean by the significance and the impact, and the timing of it, the timing of things, right? So typically late in a bout, time is running out, is when the total bout concepts and your evaluation process come into play. And again, that's what we're talking about, that whole idea of, hey, these guys have scored 0 points as an officiating team, and philosophically, UWW rules, we have to make calls to make it clear to everybody who the winner of the bout is. And we want to do that. We want to consider the entire bout when we're making those decisions, right? It's not just in this 20-second snippet, oh, this guy's being more aggressive, so I'm going to call the other guy. It's considering the whole bout, right? And Tim notes down here that this is a good coaching note because it's counterintuitive to folk style, right? And so this is where, Tim, I kind of moved your slides around a little bit. Whoops. because I thought it was important to kind of talk about the difference between folk style. You know, as Americans, most of us started with folk style. Most of us kind of have that in I see Robbie shaking his head, but you're one of the lucky ones, Robbie. So, but you know, your typical American wrestler probably started in some folk style program, and that's what they see on TV during the NCAAs. And so that's where their biases come from. And that's an important piece of our development in this country in wrestling, but it's also like breaking bad habits, right? I was at the women's NCAA, like the first one, and dealing with the host coach, and he kept talking about stalling. Like he kept using that terminology, right? And so it's educational programs like this where we work to kind of differentiate those two, right? So and so using stalling as a way to initially teach somebody like about freestyle and Greco, like you can use that term, but it's not really accurate, right? So Tim quotes the rule book here, the NFHS rules. Each wrestler is required to make, sorry, I got pictures in my way here, an honest attempt to stay within 10-foot circle, wrestle aggressively, regardless of position, time, or score, right? I remember when I was being trained as a folk style official, hey, when you see calling, you call stalling, or sorry, when you see stalling, you call stalling, right? Passivity is a little bit different, right? Passivity, again, is that total bout concept where I'm considering the total bout, how many points have been scored, who's been scoring those points, certainly who's been making attempts, right? But positioning and things of that nature. Not just, you know, one of the best folk style officials I know out here in California, he counts shots, like he counts them in his head. Like that makes zero sense to me, counting shots. But again, that's how he thinks. But for me, I'm looking at more who is creating positions that can create scoring, right? And then our friend Roy Scott, Tim always includes this quote: just because you're doing something doesn't mean anything. If you haven't scored, you're passive. The absence of scoring is the absence of action. I like to use the John Wooden quote in all the clinics I give. John Wooden says, never mistake activity for achievement, right? So just because you're doing stuff doesn't mean you've achieved anything, right? When points go on the board, you've achieved something. And until points go on the board, you can be called for passivity. And so, you know, in speaking to coaches, that's what you need to know. If my athlete hasn't put points on the board, doesn't matter if you've taken 5, 10 shots. Certainly, that's something we will consider. But when there aren't points on the board, just know everybody's fair game for being called for passivity. Okay. All right. And so here are some things that we do look at when considering, you know, the definition of passivity: evading into and staying in the passivity zone, interlocking fingers, grabbing wrists without intentionally looking for some sort of attack, continually breaking contact, you know, simulated attacks, faked attacks, general defensive wrestling, and moving backwards. So those are things that we look at as passivity. Negative wrestling is a more intense version of that, right? Negative wrestling is like, now this guy has no chance of getting any kind of hold or lock that he can score with. Blocking with the head, butt out, right? Hips back, moving backwards, you know, generally evading contact, evading wrestling, negative wrestling. We'll look at some specific situations later with some videos, but, you know, direct hands to the face. It's funny, again, we're talking about like the philosophical differences between folk style and the international styles. You know, we're at our high school state meet and a guy's got a 2-on-1 and this guy's got his hand firmly imprinted on the guy's cheek and going directly backwards. And, you know, coaches are like, that's great wrestling. And you know, as an international styles guy, it drives me nuts, right? Like, no, that's a foul. Right? So yeah, negative wrestling, things that just prevent anybody from scoring, right? So, all right. So the first question we asked, does the action prevent getting a lock or hooking? And again, I just talked about this. If the answer to that question is yes, it's probably negative wrestling, right? My butt's out, I'm moving backwards, I got my hand in your face. there's no way that somebody who wants to be offensive has any chance of scoring in those situations. So that would be negative wrestling. If the answer to that question is no, then the next question is, okay, does the action prevent starting an attack, or does the position prevent starting an attack? So maybe, I'm holding center, but I'm blocking with my forearms, right? Or I'm holding on to a wrist with, again, no intention of doing anything active with that. Like, those are passivity, right? So again, you're not running away from me. You're not preventing things that I could score with, but it's going to be, you're not trying to score, right? And Tim notes, if excessive passivity could eventually be called negative wrestling. Okay? But a better way to look at this is this paradigm shift of, instead of me constantly trying to identify who the passive wrestler is, let's start looking at who the active wrestler is, right? What are things I can identify? Because that's easier. Those are things that we can identify. I wish I had the statistic, and somebody has it. I know Zach Era is the one who originally pulled the statistics, but I think it was the 2016 Olympics, maybe it's 2012, but there was some statistic in Greco where all the points from the feet, like 95% of the points from the feet, or 98%, came from some sort of hook, right? It's from an underhook, it's from an overhook. That led to points. And so I think that's where they came to this idea of hey, if you are preventing somebody from getting a hook, that's negative wrestling. We're not going to get points if we don't get people engaged with their bodies and in a hooking position. So that's one of the main things we're looking for, right? We want to see people engage in some sort of hooking technique. All right. So the best way to avoid, and I talked about this already, the best way to avoid passivity, score points, right? If you got points on the board, the likelihood of us calling you for passivity greatly decreases. Understanding passivity, timing, philosophy can help determine coaching tactics. So this is, to me, the secret sauce. If you understand how we're going to, it's really, again, it's a formula. It's kind of spelled out for us. That's what I love about these sets of rules. If you follow the formula as a referee, you'll be successful. And if athletes know the formula, they should be successful because they know exactly what's coming, right? So again, don't be surprised if your wrestler gets hit with the first two passivity calls of the bout. Mainly, in my mind, talking about freestyle, right? That warning, and they may come right back at you and put you on the activity time. If you're wrestling cadets or below, there isn't a warning. If they're talking to you, understand they're talking to you, you're going on the clock right away. And I would say internationally, this has been my experience when I travel abroad, it is more likely in freestyle, we're talking, if you get warned first, it's more likely you're going on the activity time first. That's been my experience. Here in the States, sometimes we go back and forth more, but when you're overseas, if they give you a warning, chances are they're coming right back at you. So just know that. Yeah.
We talk about philosophy. Okay. So I know coaches sitting in the corner, don't understand the fairness. I hear the fairness of the call. Well, the blue wrestler just got called for passivity, and he just got his first warning. What has he done since then? Has he scored? No, he has not. When we reach that timing gate, he's already been warned. I'm hitting him again because he has not corrected the behavior we wanted him to correct and score. So philosophically, sitting in the corner for the coaches, understand that it's not it doesn't have to be, I call red, then I call blue. Philosophically, I hit blue, he didn't score after I hit him, I'm going to hit him again, and we're going to score, and I'm going to set up my calls. So understand the philosophy, and like Nick was saying, the formula, the philosophy in the formula is very important. Nick.
So again, and I'll keep reiterating this throughout the evening. Everything I'm talking about, when we're talking about passivity, honestly, I'm thinking about 0-0. I'm thinking about guys who haven't scored. Because if I start from that, we can build on more of the philosophy, right? But from a 0-0 match in a freestyle bout, again, here's the secret sauce. Here's the formula. We're going to make 3 calls in the first period, and we're going to make 2 calls in the second. That's the formula. So just know it. Just know that's what's going to happen, right? And again, I'm talking about a 3-minute period in freestyle because cadets and below are 2 minutes, right? So those first two the first call on either wrestler, that's a warning, but it does result in us stopping the bout, right? And we'll give that single hand motion. That's your first warning, right? So I want to get my warning in on both wrestlers in the first period and have one activity time in the first period. Now, the order of that might change, right? As we just alluded to, I might warn blue and come right back at blue and put them on the activity time. Just understand, I'm also going to warn red before this period's over. That's going to happen, okay? And so, again, and we deal with it more here in the States because of that idea of stalling that is entrenched in the minds of coaches. Again, we might see a wrestler who is, making attacks or making shots and things of that nature. And then they wonder, well, how can you call my guy for passivity? Again, if he has not scored points, I can do that anytime I want. That's how, right? If he's not putting points on the board, by definition, we can consider him passive. Okay. So again, the formula for freestyle, 3 calls in the first, 2 calls in the second. In Greco, it's 1 call in the first, 2 calls in the second. Again, that's the formula. It's not changing. You can expect it. Again, in a 0-0 match, that's how it's going to go. Okay. We evaluate activity versus passivity. And I alluded to this already. Passivity is subjective and difficult to identify, but activity is easier for us to identify, right? Who's making contact, who's moving forward, who's taking hooks, who's making attacks. That one taking ground was one I had to learn. And that tough match I had in the semis of the US Open was because I didn't consider that, right? I didn't consider like taking ground is a big piece of that. So this guy's head might be down. He might look like he's blocking, but he's the only guy moving forward, right? And that's something you have to consider as well. So, and then Tim talks about technical passivity, right? Get these guys, again, mistaking activity for achievement. Guys look really good doing nothing, right? They look really pretty not scoring. That's still passivity, right? So, all right. Okay, 2023 point of emphasis. So on the left, you see correct Greco-Roman position, right? So what I see is their heads are up, their butts are in for the most part, and they're not bent over, right? So that's good Greco position, okay? One guy's got a hook. From that position, they can engage, and both guys can be digging and looking for hooks. The position on the right is negative wrestling, okay? So again, I see one guy's trying to make contact. Guy in blue's got a hook, and his chest is still up and his head is still up. The other guy has his butt out and his head down, and he's got his hand on the guy's throat. Like that's textbook negative wrestling, right? So first time would be attention. Next time, this would be caution and 1 for fleeing the hold. Okay. Tim, am I good on that? Anything else you want to add to that? Okay.
You're spot on, Nick.
All right. Okay. Greco activity identifiers. Again, who's making contact versus who's, you see guys who will come in, make contact, and then immediately push off, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about guys who are making contact and staying engaged, because what's the next thing that it says? Looking for hooks, right? If I make good contact, the next step would be I'm trying to hook something. And then from that point, are they setting up attacks? Okay. And again, eventually, could I call a guy who is looking for hooks? Could I call him for passivity? Yeah, eventually. If he hasn't scored, yes. Probably not going to call him first, right? But that's why that third part's important, right? If he's constantly making contact, constantly getting hooks, but then just kind of holding on, that wrestler too could be called for passivity, and will be if there aren't points on the board. Okay. All right. So Greco-Roman hooking target areas. I like this graphic because it's all highlighted for you. And it talks about where we're looking for hooks, right? So you got underhook, you've got body lock, front headlock, over under, right? Both of those are kind of over under, these over here on the right. And then what I would call a pinch headlock, arm and headlock. And so again, all of those though involve hooking. One of the times, again, I always share my tough positions, because those are the ones we learn from, right? I always remember all my losses way more than my wins. So I remember, I think there's a video like this later in here. But in Greco-Roman, when you've got two guys in an over-under situation, get the hell out of their way, because somebody should score there, right? Like, I think Halverson needs to call that a 50-50, right? Like, it's 50-50. Nobody's got an advantage. Somebody's going to score. So I made the mistake once of calling a guy for passivity when they were at the US Open in a medal match with 13 points on the board, and they were in an over-under situation. I called somebody for passivity. So for you young referees out there, don't do that, right? When they're in an over-under, get out of their way. Somebody should score, okay? Particularly in Greco. Robbie, you get your hand up.
2-on-1 position. I know right now we're looking at a lot of guys going forward into you and hooking a traditional underhook. What is the consideration of a referee of a 2-on-1 position?
So again, what we want ultimately is hooks, right? That's what we want, because that's what leads to scoring. In the absence of that, then we have to consider other positions, right? So for me, if you've got a 2-on-1 and you're taking ground, that's activity, right? And so I would prefer you had a hook. That would be my, right? That's what I would want. But in the absence of that, and again, you have your job as an athlete and as a coach. We have our job as officials. And so ideally, I would want some sort of hook as an official. But again, in the absence of that, you with a 2-on-1 and taking ground and working for positions, you're being active, right?
Yep.
All right. Okay, Greco passivity rules. So first passivity, regardless of which wrestler, the bout is stopped, 1 point awarded, and choice of parterre position, right? And again, that's going to happen in the first period, and that there's only going to be one passivity call in the first period of wrestling. Okay? In a 3-minute period, maybe we talk about timing later, but I'm going to talk about timing now. In a 3-minute period, ideally, I want to blow my whistle really like a minute 20, a minute 30 into the bout. I want to give you plenty of time. And when I say you, I mean both athletes, plenty of time to kind of develop their strategy, develop their holds. And that gives me time to evaluate, okay, who's being the aggressor here, right? That's not something in Greco that you can evaluate in 30 seconds, right? Freestyle, you can evaluate much quicker. But in Greco, it takes time. Like, it's a war of attrition, right? So you will see, and I'll just be frank with everybody on this call, you will see at the US Open, people get antsy and they'll start making that call right at 1 minute, 1:05. And again, I was writing down some of the things Gary was saying. Gary said professionals are patient, right? If there's something I could instill in younger referees that I've had to learn over time, as I just alluded to in that 50-50 over-under situation, I felt like I needed to call something, like just back off and be patient, right? Because we want points. We want the athletes to score points. I would rather them do it than me have to get involved. And so with that in mind, really your passivity call, you should be setting up maybe 50 seconds into the bout and talking to the athlete and letting everybody know what your thoughts are, right? With that UWW vocabulary, blue head up, blue contact, blue attack, right? So I'm telling everybody, look, nothing changes here. I'm going to call blue. I'm letting everybody know that. But I'm also giving blue an opportunity to respond to that, right? So so I'm going to make my passivity call in the first period. Ideally, it'd be like right at the 1:30 mark. That's what I would want, right? Now, of course, the bout dictates, but that's what I'm shooting for. Around 1:30 is when I'm going to, I'll ask for it somewhere between 1:20 and 1:30. I'll get it confirmed, blow my whistle between 1:25, 1:30 elapsed. And so I'm putting them into parterre right around that 1:30 mark. The other piece of that is I'm going to, and this is for the coaches, we've had a minute and a half of no scoring on their feet. That guy earned that position, right? Whoever earned that position, they earned the right to work there for a while. I'm not bringing them up after 10 or 15 seconds. They're going to spend some time there. And I'm going to let the guy try and develop a lock. And then once he gets a lock, I'm going to let him try and use that lock. So just understand, it's not like freestyle parterre. Like, again, I just saw them on their feet for a minute and a half. I'm not in a rush to get them back to that, right? Let's see what they can do in that position. And is that unfair to the bottom guy? I don't know. Sure. And I think Na alluded to that. Yeah, it's a penalty. So yeah, he has to defend for a while. That's part of the deal, right? So, okay. The second passivity call, again, this will happen in the second period. It will happen quicker. Again, 0-0 bout will be 1-0 at this point, right? But nobody scored any technical points. This one will happen a little bit quicker, probably like 40 or 50 seconds into the period. And again, there's a cheat sheet on here. I'm going to tell everybody when we get to it, take a picture of this, because this is the one that you want to show your athletes and that you want to like memorize, right? But 40 or 50 seconds into that second period, I'm going to call, and I kind of pause there, right? Who am I going to call? Well, the bout dictates who I'm going to call. But I will say, for me to call the same guy twice, it needs to be pretty clear. It needs to be pretty overwhelming that the one guy has been the aggressor and been clearly the aggressor. And that happens. That certainly happens. The best example that I've ever seen of this is the 2021 Tokyo Games heavyweights. Jean Lopez, like he does his job in the first period to get the passivity call, and then the second period comes out and he does his job double, right? Like he makes it clear to everybody in the freaking world, there ain't no way you could call me for passivity right now, right? That's the best example of what I'm talking about. Like you got to make it really clear. If it's not overwhelmingly clear, it's probably going back the other way, to be honest, right? So, but then the third piece, right? So if I make that call 40, 50 seconds into the period, again, we're going to spend another 30 seconds there. Why am I talking about all this? Because what did we say that fourth piece is? The clock, right? We have to structure our passivity calls in a way that let things develop, but also allow for time on the clock so that everybody kind of understands what's going on, right? So after 40 or 50 seconds into the second period, I've made my next call. Now I've passivity, 1 point, put them in parterre. They're going to wrestle there for another 30 seconds. So by the time that whole situation is ended, we've got about a minute, 40 seconds left in the bout, right? And now I'm probably looking to make a third call, potentially. I'll tell you this. Let's say it's red got the last point, right? So I called red in the first period. It was passive red, 1 blue. Blue's winning 1-0. Second period, I call blue, passive blue, 1 red. Red's winning 1-1, okay? There is no purpose in me calling blue for passivity on a third call, right? Because if I call blue for passivity, I'm putting the guy who's winning down and red's killing time on top. It doesn't serve much purpose, right? So if I make that third call in a 1-1 situation, I'm probably making it because red's being passive or blue's being more active and being aggressive, right? So I'm going to give the guy who's losing a shot on top. For sure, I say for sure, every bout is different, but if I call the same guy twice and it's 2-0 on passivity calls, it's pretty good chance that guy who's winning 2-0 is going down at some point before the bout's over, right? Because if blue's able to get on top and get a turn, that's 2 technical points. That's better than 2 passivity points that the officiating team had to give, right? So just understand that. Who gets called and who's winning will dictate how that third call comes in. But I'm going to want to make that third call such that when they return to standing, there's about 45 seconds left or more. Okay. And that's tough to do. It's tough to structure all your calls so that when it's all the smoke is cleared and everything's done and all the calls have been made, there's still time on the clock for everybody in the facility to know who's winning. And they still have time to go figure it out on their own, right? And that's kind of, again, when we step on the mat and we assume it's going to be 0-0, the rules dictate that we have to make certain calls, but we also want to make those calls and leave enough time on the clock so that everybody knows, hey, everybody knows who's winning right now, and there's not 10 seconds left. There's 45 seconds left. Now, go figure it out, right? So, and just keep in mind when I say it like that, that means the wrestlers didn't do anything to score any kind of technical points for the first, 5 minutes, 15 seconds. So, all right. So this is the one where I say, get your cameras out, take a picture of this. This is what you want to know, right? This is really what I just took everybody through on the Greco side. One call in the first, and that's what the timing looks like. And then 2 calls in the second, and that's what the timing looks like. And everything's within about 10 seconds of each other, but this is the formula that we're going to follow. Okay. I assume, Tim, you're going to share this out with everybody as well. Yeah. But this is, to me, these are the most important slides. It's the formula that we follow, and it's the timing that we follow. And I tell young officials, if you want to go from good to great, there's 2 things you got to be good at. You got to be good at edge calls, and you got to know this stuff in and out, right? This stuff just has to be second nature to you. All right. So let's look at some evaluation of activity or passivity, right? So who's the passive wrestler? So already I'm seeing, red has broke contact a few times. Red could dig that hook. He doesn't really want to. Blue's moving forward. Blue's got a hook. So now this is where it gets tough, right? We're 42 seconds in. Red's passive, but I'm not making that call. I'm still letting him wrestle for another 30, 35 seconds because I really want to evaluate. Maybe blue starts to wear down and red starts coming the other direction, right? But again, these are red passivity. So just giving you some examples of what that looks like. So red's got an overhook, but head down. Blue's moving forward. Blue's heads up. Blue's got hooks. Again, blue's taking ground. Again, I like both of those examples because again, it's a long period of time. You have to evaluate this, right? It's not a snapshot. It's not 5 seconds. It's, hey, over the course of 30 seconds to 60 seconds, who is being active, right? All right. Okay, moving to freestyle. Did I skip one? I think I got it. Okay, moving to freestyle. Again, activity identifiers. Who's grabbing hands and hanging on the hands? It's a big one in freestyle, right? We've seen that carry over to folk style where they stop the match now because nothing active is going to happen when we've got intertwined fingers. Who's controlling the center? And then who's actually taking risk and attacking? Attack. Got Sammy out there. So again, just a good example of you can call the same guy 2 in a row. That's not a problem. And again, overseas, that's what you're going to see, honestly. The 1 point to red, right? Regardless of if blue doesn't